Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: sleep, or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before memory foam mattresses and blackout curtains, sleep was something of a public spectacle. If you think insomnia is modern, wait until you learn that medieval people didn't even try to sleep through the night in one go. They had something called segmented sleep, which sounds like a productivity hack but was really just the way they operated. One long, cozy slumber? Not quite. Instead, they had a first sleep and a second sleep, with a mysterious waking period in between. This wasn't considered unusual, it was just how sleep worked. First sleep started after dusk and lasted a few hours. Then people would wake up on purpose for an hour or two, maybe longer, and do, well, strange things. They prayed. They whispered secrets. They stoked the fire. Some even visited neighbors or had a quiet drink. Others wrote poetry by candlelight. Yes, apparently inspiration struck hardest at 2 a.m. in a freezing stone hut. If you were lucky, you'd curl back up for your second sleep and drift off until sunrise. This pattern shows up in literature, medical texts, and even legal documents from the time. People expected this middle-of-the-night wakefulness, and they used it. Our modern obsession with getting a full 8 hours would have seemed silly to them. What kind of peasant has the luxury of uninterrupted rest? And sleeping arrangements? Let's just say cozy doesn't quite cover it. Families often slept in the same room. In fact, they often slept in the same bed. Not just parents and children. Sometimes guests, servants, even animals were invited under the covers. That wasn't considered strange. It was practical. Beds were expensive, homes were small, and winters were cruel. If your pig wanted to snuggle at night, you welcomed the warmth. Privacy was overrated and personal space didn't exist. Not in the modern sense. Let's take a moment to appreciate the medieval bed itself. It wasn't always a grand, carved thing with curtains and canopies. That was for the wealthy. Most peasants slept on a straw mattress stuffed into a wooden frame, or just on the floor. Over time, mattresses were filled with rags, feathers, or even pea pods. Imagine the crunch. There were no fitted sheets, no duvets. Blankets were woolen, scratchy, and heavy, and probably never really clean. Pillows? A log, maybe, or your own arm. And yet, somehow, people managed to fall asleep. Now, imagine the sounds of a medieval night. Not the white noise of a fan, but the clatter of rats in the walls, the groan of settling wood, the snore of a sibling, the low breathing of an ox in the corner. Church bells might ring out every few hours, reminding everyone that time was still moving, even in the dark. Your neighbor might shout something while passing outside. Or worse, there might be silence. In some places, silence was more unsettling than noise. Lighting was minimal. Maybe a tallow candle if you had one. Maybe just embers from the hearth. The world went dark early, and unless the moon was bright, most of the night was spent wrapped in shadow. Darkness was feared, respected, and thick. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a thing, almost a presence. People believed demons, spirits, and night walkers roamed freely. Sleep was not just rest, it was a vulnerable act. You were defenseless against dreams, omens, and things that slithered in the dark. And so people prepared. They said prayers before bed, not just out of piety, but as protection. "Now I lay me down to sleep" wasn't poetic, it was strategic. Some kept charms near the bed. Others etched protective symbols above doorframes. It wasn't just superstition, it was survival. Nightmares were often interpreted as messages or warnings. Dream interpretation was an actual field of study. Scholars and mystics alike tried to decode what the subconscious was trying to say, and why it chose to say it between the first and second sleep. Of course, all of this was made worse in winter. Cold seeped through stone walls. Windows were little more than wooden shutters. Insulation? Non-existent. People huddled together like a litter of kittens. They wore layers to bed, woolen tunics, socks, even hats. Yes, the classic nightcap wasn't a fashion statement. It was insulation. Hot coals were placed in metal bed warmers and slid under the sheets. Some burned their feet. Others warmed bricks or bottles. A warm bed was a rare luxury and often involved trial and error, and the occasional scorched blanket. Children didn't have bedrooms. They didn't even always have beds. They might sleep in a corner, wrapped in an old cloak. Servants slept wherever there was space, often near the kitchen for warmth. Entire households adjusted their schedules around the light and the cold. Sleeping in wasn't laziness, it was strategy. And yet, despite all of this, sleep remained essential, mysterious, and strangely communal. And then there were dreams. Dreams were everything. They were considered messages from God or from something darker. A good dream might be written down, analyzed, even shared with a priest. A bad dream could be an omen or a sign of poor digestion. The line between the spiritual and the physical was blurry. People believed that eating certain foods before bed, like onions, beans, or cheese, could bring disturbing visions. Flatulence and demons were sometimes confused. Sleepwalkers were feared and pitted. A person who walked in the night might be seen as cursed or touched by something unnatural. Night terrors, sleep paralysis, and sudden awakenings were given supernatural explanations. Medicine had no answers. Priests might be summoned, amulets tied to the bedposts. In extreme cases, the afflicted might even be exorcised just in case. And yet, sleep was also a gentle release. For those who labored all day, plowing, washing, baking, weaving, it was a small gift, a quiet vanishing into the warm dark. In a world that was often brutal, sleep offered a rare escape, even if it came in strange, segmented pieces. A medieval night was rarely silent. You'd think the world then, without cars or electricity, would have been calm, peaceful, and quiet. But no, the medieval village was alive after sundown with the soft moo of cows, the flutter of chickens disturbed in their roost, the creak of timber houses adjusting in the cold. Dogs barked at shadows. Roosters sometimes crowed at the moon, confused and unhelpful. And if your home was near a tavern, you'd have the lullaby of drunken giggles and the occasional lute strum playing you into slumber or away from it. Most peasants slept in one room with their entire family, and if you think that sounds cute, like a rustic sleepover, you're sorely mistaken. There were snoring parents, gassy uncles, crying babies, wheezing grandmothers, and lice, always lice, partaking in their nightly buffet on exposed skin. If privacy was a luxury today, back then it was sorcery. You could not be alone unless you were rich or in the latrine. Even then, someone might knock. People didn't sleep through the night in one long stretch either. There was something called segmented sleep, a totally normal, accepted way to rest. You'd go to bed just after dusk, sleep for 4 hours or so, then wake up around midnight. This in-between time, called the watch or first wake, was used for prayer, reading, talking, sex, or, if you were feeling especially pious, repenting for your sins in the flickering light of a tallow candle. Sometimes people just sat in the dark thinking. Imagine that. No phone, no scroll, just a medieval person, awake at midnight, contemplating life and whether they left the barn door open. Then, after an hour or two, they'd slip into second sleep, which lasted until dawn. Doctors even recommended it, this broken pattern of rest. They believed your digestion worked better that way. And who were we to argue? They also believed sneezes expelled evil spirits. Beds, of course, weren't always involved. The poor might sleep on straw pallets, stuffed with hay or rushes that reeked of mildew and rodents. No sheets, no pillows, just a shared blanket, maybe made of wool, maybe of itchy linen, maybe of whatever cloth wasn't being used as clothing. And sometimes even that had to be shared with the goats. Nobles fared better. Four-poster beds with embroidered curtains to keep out the cold and prying eyes. Feather mattresses were a delicacy, as was being allowed to sleep alone. But even in castles, rooms weren't heated unless you were basically royalty. Fires were expensive, wood had to be chopped or bought, and so many nobles still slept fully clothed, sometimes with dogs at their feet. Not because it was cute, but because the dogs were warm. Sleeping naked was rarely an option unless you were both rich and reckless. Medieval folks feared being caught unprepared if death came in the night. Imagine your soul leaving your body during a plague dream, and you show up to heaven completely nude. That simply wouldn't do. Better to wear your best woolen tunic, or at least a shift, so you could die with dignity. And the cold, oh the cold. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was invasive. Drafts crept in through stone walls and under doors. The damp chill settled into your bones and made your teeth ache. People would sleep with hats on. Yes, sleep hats weren't just cartoonish nightwear, they were survival gear. Some wore scarves, mittens, or even boots to bed. Your bedmate's body was another heat source, and so yes, spooning was not about love, it was about survival. And yet, in some places, you didn't even get a real bed. There were truckle beds that slid underneath bigger beds, where servants slept like medieval drawer people. Or bench beds, made from wood with scratchy padding and the lingering aroma of every back that had ever laid on it. Let's not forget the co-sleeping with animals. It wasn't rare for dogs, cats, pigs, or chickens to share the sleeping space. Especially in winter, a pig's body heat was more valuable than its manners. They'd huddle near the hearth, if you were lucky enough to have one, and grunt softly into the night. In monasteries, things got even more regimented. Monks had assigned sleep times, and were often woken in the middle of the night to chant. They slept on hard surfaces with minimal bedding to discourage dreams, comfort, or anything remotely pleasant. After all, sleep was merely a pause in your earthly trial, not a time to indulge. And dreams, those slippery, moonlit visions, were not always welcome. They were interpreted as omens or warnings. A dream about falling might mean you were destined to sin. A dream about food could be gluttony whispering to your soul. And romantic dreams? Let's just say the church had thoughts. Guilty ones. You could confess your dreams if you were feeling especially holy, or just worried the local priest might already know. Snoring was considered a nuisance, yes, but also a sign of weakness. Some thought it meant your soul was not fully protected. Others believed it invited demons. Yes, demons. So if someone snored in the middle of the night, you might give them a quick jab with your elbow. Not just out of annoyance, but out of fear for their eternal safety. Even the direction in which you slept mattered. East was preferred, it aligned with Jerusalem and the rising sun. North, that was cold and unspiritual. The devil probably slept with his head pointing north, and that was enough to make everyone else face south. Candles flickered through the night, not only for warmth, but to keep the dark at bay. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was haunted. There were tales of night walkers, witches, restless spirits, and things that wandered in the fog. If you woke up during the first wake and heard a sound outside, you didn't investigate. You prayed. You wrapped yourself tighter in your cloak. And you pretended you didn't hear the footsteps, because sleep in the medieval world wasn't peaceful. It was tactical, survival-oriented, layered with superstition and ritual. It wasn't about rest, it was about making it to morning. Now, imagine waking up in the dead of night not because of a nightmare or a sudden noise, but because it was simply time. In the medieval world, this wasn't strange at all. It was expected. Welcome to the concept of first sleep and second sleep. Yes, people of the past took nighttime intermission very seriously. They would drift off soon after dusk, around 8 or 9 p.m., then awaken around midnight or a bit later. But instead of tossing and turning and checking their sundials in frustration, they embraced it. This in-between time, known as the watch, was a perfectly normal and even productive part of their lives. During this gap, people prayed, read by candlelight, tended to animals, chatted with family, visited neighbors, or Well, rekindled intimacy. Monks sometimes rose to chant. Peasants stoked their fires. The wealthy might pace the halls or jot thoughts in a handwritten journal illuminated by flickering beeswax. No one asked if something was wrong. They simply understood this as the rhythm of the night. It wasn't insomnia. It was a lifestyle. Some medical texts of the era even recommended it. First sleep to refresh the body, second sleep to restore the soul. Physicians advised against eating too heavily before the first sleep, but recommended a bit of warmed ale or spiced wine during the watch. A warm mug, a warm hearth, a slow conversation in the dark, strangely comforting. Of course, not all midnight awakenings were serene. Sometimes that middle hour was when fears crept in. Witches, demons, and the devil himself were thought to be particularly active between midnight and 3 a.m., a time now dubbed the witching hour. Sleeping through it might have been the safe option, but medieval folk seemed content to risk it. Perhaps a prayer or two would suffice, or garlic on the windowsill, or sleeping with iron under the bed. Just in case. Another curious sleep aid of the time was the bedfellow. No, not in a romantic sense, although sometimes yes, but more often a practical arrangement. In cold seasons, 2, 3, or more people might share a bed, even if they weren't related. Heat was precious, firewood was finite, and a human heater, though occasionally snoring, was still better than freezing. Boarding schools, monasteries, inns, and even noble households had shared beds. Travelers might lie side by side with strangers, men with men, women with women, or, on occasion, everyone in a row, separated by cloth or custom. One 15th century innkeeper in France offered half a bed as a pricing option. You paid less, but you'd be sharing a straw mattress with another guest. Hope they weren't chatty. Beds themselves were strange things, more like platforms surrounded by curtains. The wealthy had canopies to keep in the heat and out the rats. The poor might have a sack on the floor, stuffed with hay, leaves, or rags. Sheets? Rare. Pillowcases? A luxury. Mattresses were heavy and hard to move, often infested with mites, fleas, or worse. To freshen a mattress, one did not wash it, heavens no. Instead, you aired it out, beat it with a stick, or, if you were very sophisticated, sprinkled herbs in the straw. Lavender, rosemary, wormwood, all to mask the scent of years of sweat, dust, and whatever else had soaked into the bedding. Let us not forget the chamber pot, a nightly necessity. Few dared venture out into the cold, especially if wolves or spirits were rumored to haunt the village paths. So a ceramic or wooden pot was kept near the bed, perhaps under it. In the dark, you'd feel your way to it, do your business, and, if you were lucky, not knock it over. The rich had night stools with lids. The poor simply hoped the dog wouldn't drink from it. It's important to understand that night in the medieval world was never completely silent. That romantic image of a peaceful moonlit village? Not quite. There were barking dogs, crowing roosters who couldn't tell time, distant church bells, drunken neighbors, owls, wolves, and worse, tax collectors by morning. And let's not ignore the fear of fire. Thatched roofs, open flames, candles left burning. Accidents happened. Entire streets burned down in a single night. People kept water jugs nearby and prayed that the wind wouldn't carry embers from a neighbor's chimney. Still, for many, the night held mystery, wonder, and quiet reflection. It was the only time when the chaos of the day, plowing, weaving, shouting, sweating, faded into whispers. Under the heavy quilts, by the flicker of oil lamps, people dreamed. And sometimes those dreams were believed to carry messages from the divine. Dream interpretation was serious business. Some thought dreams revealed the future. Others feared they were tricks of demons. A good dream might lead to a pilgrimage. A bad dream might require confession. Priests were occasionally called upon to decode recurring images. White horses, black birds, lost shoes. Each symbol had meaning, layered and mysterious. One monk's diary mentions dreaming of a ladder reaching the heavens, only to awaken and trip over a chicken in the dark. Another woman dreamed of falling into a well, then refused to leave her cottage for weeks. The line between vision and madness was thin, and so the night passed, between sleep and wake, warmth and cold, reality and dream. It wasn't always peaceful. It wasn't always comfortable. But it was their night, their strange, echoing, shivering, communal, creaky, dreaming night. And for some, that first whisper of dawn, the cold breath of morning, was a relief. Chickens rustled, children stirred, the coals still glowed in the hearth. Time to begin again, except for the few lucky ones, those who could steal a few more minutes of second sleep, curled beneath scratchy blankets, avoiding the morning chores just a little longer. Because some things about sleep never change. As the night deepened and the flickering hearth gave its final sigh, the medieval sleeper would roll into the next phase of slumber with surprising formality. You see, in those days, sleep was not one long, uninterrupted affair. It was parceled into neat, expected segments, first sleep and second sleep. Between these two halves, this curious middle-of-the-night intermission, people would rise, think, pray, relieve themselves, or talk to their bedmates. Sometimes they even paid visits to neighbors. Yes, you heard that correctly. Night visits, in the dark, on purpose. It sounds like a plot point from a dream, but for the medieval mind, waking in the dead of night wasn't odd. It was expected. Monks documented this habit in their abbey logs. Physicians endorsed it. Poets romanticized it. There were even manuals discussing what one should and should not do between first and second sleep, as if it were a social season rather than a sleepy hiccup. Some scholars believe this habit emerged from the body's natural rhythms. Without electric light to stretch the waking hours into infinity, the medieval day was governed by the sun and the fire. You'd sleep soon after sunset, wake around midnight, and then, after an hour or two of contemplative stillness or suspicious activity, drift off into your second sleep, which arguably was the better one, less fidgety, deeper, richer in dreams. And speaking of dreams, how they adored them. People of the Middle Ages treated dreams the way we treat browser history, carefully, with suspicion, with the hope that no one else saw them, but also with an odd fascination. Dreams were signs, prophecies, messages from the divine or possibly from the cheese you ate at supper. Books of dream interpretation were wildly popular. Did you dream of pigs? That might mean an impending loss of property. White horses, a rise in fortune. Snakes? Well, those were always problematic. Either betrayal, illness, or some less polite implication involving lust. The point is, no medieval person woke up and brushed off their dreams. No, they sat with them, pondered them, sometimes even took action based on them. A particularly troubling dream might send someone to confession or to the local herbalist for preventative measures. After all, your dreams might be whispering what your body already knew. And then, there were the beds themselves, humble, scratchy, sacred things. A typical peasant bed was nothing like the layered softness we now associate with rest. At best, you might find a wooden frame with rope supports, some old straw stuffed into ticking, and a coarse linen sheet if you were lucky. Wealthier folks had fancier setups, pillows with actual down, mattresses filled with moss or wool, and embroidered canopies that doubled as insulation. But even then, you didn't sleep alone. Not really. Sharing a bed was the default. It didn't necessarily imply intimacy, it implied economy. Families of 4 or 5 would huddle together in one large bed, not just for warmth but for safety. Bedfellows weren't always family either. Travelers could expect to share a bed at an inn with total strangers. Just imagine checking into your local hotel and discovering you've been assigned a roommate in the bed, with no dividers. That was normal. Children, too, weren't tucked away in their own rooms. They often slept right next to their parents or grandparents, absorbing their snores, their stories, and possibly their fleas. Privacy, in the modern sense, didn't exist. Your dreams, your murmurs, your midnight rustlings, they were part of the household symphony. And speaking of fleas, No conversation about medieval sleep would be complete without revisiting that scratchy, skittery reality. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were simply part of life. They inhabited mattresses like we now inhabit coffee shops. People had little sticks, yes, actual lice sticks, to comb their hair before sleep. Not for vanity, for pest control. Households might air out mattresses by hanging them over the beams. They might sprinkle dried herbs like lavender or rue into bedding to deter unwelcome guests. But ultimately, the relationship between humans and bugs was companionable, resigned, sometimes even affectionate. A medieval sleeper might not have named his fleas, but he certainly spoke of them as constant, as neighbors, as warm-blooded parasites who, like himself, needed rest. Still, there were rituals to be followed. Before bed, many people recited prayers, hoping to ward off demons, restless souls, and the eternal fear of dying in one's sleep, which, considering the mortality rate, was a fairly reasonable concern. Death was never far from the medieval bed. Women died in childbirth, children died of fevers, old men died simply because there were no antibiotics. Sleep and death were close companions, not just in metaphor but in lived experience. To sleep in that world was to surrender with a degree of faith, a pinch of fear, and a heap of bedmates. And you hope to wake up, not in heaven, not in purgatory, but just there, in the same scratchy bed, surrounded by the same snoring family, with the same flickering fire and the same fleas plotting their next feast. And so the medieval night stretched on. Not quiet, not private, not sterile. It was a living, breathing organism, creaked and whispered, it scratched and shuffled. It smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and dried herbs. And it held sleep, not as escape, but as a shared, strange, and sacred ritual. The rooster, oddly enough, was not the only one marking time. In medieval monasteries, bells tolled through the night to call monks to prayer, interrupting sleep with divine punctuality. Matins, lauds, and prime, each had its own time, and none respected the human need for deep REM cycles. While the rest of the village slept in straw-stuffed peace, or tried to, the monks rose in the freezing dark to chant Latin hymns to cold stone walls, their breath steaming like offerings to an invisible god. In theory, this was holy devotion. In practice, it was also sleep deprivation with incense. Some monks reportedly developed ingenious ways to sleep through prayers undetected. They would lean subtly against pillars or memorize the rhythm of chants so thoroughly that they could drone through them half asleep. If you've ever mumbled through a work meeting while sleep-starved, you may have achieved monastic grace. Now, back outside the cloister, the average villager's bed was rarely private. A peasant's home was a one-room affair, shared with children, chickens, and possibly a pig or two if the weather turned cruel. Privacy was a bourgeois fantasy. Entire families, and sometimes their livestock, slept together on pallets or benches, or sometimes directly on the floor. The floor, by the way, was not just dirt, but compacted filth, often mixed with herbs to disguise the smell. But of course, there was always the bed curtain, that magical, moth-eaten barrier of linen or wool which, when drawn, granted a fleeting illusion of solitude. Couples used it for whispered conversations, stolen kisses, and occasional grumbling about the cold or the child stepping on their face. Curtains were essential not only for warmth, but for modesty, especially when you were sharing a bed with your in-laws. Yes, that was a thing. Medieval extended families didn't scatter across suburbs. They squeezed into the same bed frame and made it work. Now, let's not forget the noble class. Their beds were far superior, elevated on wooden platforms, stuffed with feathers instead of straw, and draped with velvet or damask canopies. But were they necessarily sleeping better? Not always. A large bed also meant space for courtiers, squires, or even guests. Royal visitors might share a bed, not out of intimacy, but because hospitality demanded it. King and ambassador, side by side, under embroidered covers, politely pretending not to snore. And let us talk about nightwear, or rather, the lack of it. Sleeping naked wasn't uncommon. Clothes were valuable and not always washed regularly. You didn't want to sleep in your only tunic and wake up to find it soaked in sweat or flea-bitten. So people often stripped down, or slept in their undershifts if they had one, while their outer garments hung near the hearth, collecting the scent of soot and cabbage stew. Speaking of hearths, fire was the center of nocturnal life. Before you drifted off, you'd bank the fire with ashes, hoping it wouldn't die completely before morning. A cold hearth meant stiff joints and cold porridge. For those in wealthier homes, servants were assigned to keep the fire alive, often sleeping in the same room to do so. It's quite romantic to imagine a candlelit chamber glowing with embers, until you realize there's a snoring servant under your bed tasked with poking logs every 3 hours. The cold, by the way, was a constant enemy. In winter, breath would frost against the inside of windows, and water would freeze in the basin. People brought hot stones to bed, or warmed bricks wrapped in cloth. Some even nestled animals closer at night, not out of affection but for body heat. The phrase three-dog night wasn't just a band name. It described how many dogs you needed in bed to stay alive. To warm the toes, medieval folks sometimes wore bed socks made of felt or wool, which were not nearly as cute as they sound. They itched and they smelled, and they often housed fleas. Yet people clung to them because a cold foot in a medieval winter was just a step away from gangrene. You didn't mess with frostbite when amputation was done with a dull blade and a prayer. Of course, there were the dream interpretations. Dreams were not merely oddities of the brain. They were messages, warnings, prophecies. A pig in your dream? A sign of wealth or gluttony. A falling tooth? Someone close to you would die. People kept dream books. Priests preached about the meanings. Superstitions fluttered around sleep like moths to a dying candle. Even sleep talking had its risks. If you muttered the wrong thing in your sleep, someone might assume you were bewitched or worse, revealing your sins. Inquisitors took note. Neighbors gossiped. A woman who moaned too strangely in sleep could be accused of cavorting with demons. Medieval nighttime was not only cold and communal, it was watched. And don't forget the supernatural. Midnight was not just the middle of the night, it was the witching hour. Spirits wandered, fairies lured sleepers away, and demons sat on chests to cause nightmares. Nightmares were often called night hags, because obviously women were blamed. People slept with amulets, crosses, or relics near their pillows. Sometimes a nail in the bed frame, or a knife under the mattress just in case a ghost needed stabbing. As you tucked yourself in during the 14th century, your thoughts were not of sweet dreams, but of survival. You whispered a prayer, you wrapped yourself in scratchy wool, and you hoped the rat chewing near the wall wasn't going to climb your blanket. Then, just maybe, you drifted into a broken sleep, until the rooster crowed, or the bell rang, or the baby cried, or the pig snorted in its sleep. The medieval night was not peaceful. It was a constant negotiation with cold, with noise, with family, and with the unknown. But somehow they managed to sleep. Not well, not long, but enough to survive another day of backbreaking labor and bad bread. And that, perhaps, is the strangest thing of all. Of course, if you happened to live in a monastery, your sleep schedule was no longer your own. Monastic life was built around prayer, silence, and deep spiritual discipline, none of which were particularly compatible with a full night's rest. Monks were woken in the pitch black of night by the sound of bells, roused from their straw pallets to chant in freezing chapels under flickering candlelight. This was called matins, and it was the first of many divine interruptions designed to ensure that no monk got too cozy with slumber. After all, too much sleep was thought to weaken the soul. These nightly prayers might begin around 2 or 3 a.m. Imagine stumbling barefoot across a stone corridor at that hour, the air colder than sin and your robes offering all the insulation of a damp curtain. Some monks dozed off while kneeling, heads bobbing mid-hymn. Others fell asleep in the choir stalls and were gently nudged by brothers who had already mastered the art of semi-conscious devotion. Even when the prayers were done, monks didn't always return to sleep. Some used the quiet to copy manuscripts, meditate, or simply sit and contemplate the eternal, anything but dream peacefully. To sleep too long was considered slothful. In this sense, holy men were the original sleep hackers, willingly fragmenting their nights long before it became fashionable to biohack your circadian rhythm. Out in the secular world, medieval people also believed that what you dreamed about mattered just as much as how long you slept. Dreams were often taken as messages, omens, or even divine warnings. A dream of a snake could signify deceit or temptation. A dream of water might signal emotional turmoil. And if you dreamed of pigs, well, let's just say you probably shouldn't plan any major life events that week. There were even books written to interpret dreams. A noble might consult a learned cleric to decipher the strange scenes that danced behind his eyelids. Was that dream about flying a sign of spiritual ascension, or just indigestion from the pickled eels at supper? These interpretations blended superstition with spiritualism, a strange mix of the sacred and the silly. Children, on the other hand, were largely ignored when it came to sleep routines. Babies were often wrapped tightly in swaddling bands, sometimes so firmly that their limbs were immobilized. The idea was to keep them safe and straight. Sleep for infants wasn't about rest, it was about restraint. Crying at night was often met with herbal remedies or a quick prayer. Some families, especially those in the countryside, would even keep livestock inside their homes during cold seasons. Not only did this mean extra warmth, but it also meant your sleep might be interrupted by a goat sneezing beside your straw mattress. The mingling of human and animal life was not just quaint, it was practical survival. The concept of a quiet, private bedroom was as foreign to them as Wi-Fi. Wealthier families, especially in castles or manor houses, sometimes used tapestries not just for decoration, but for warmth. Thick, woven hangings were placed on walls or around beds to trap heat and block drafts. A nobleman might retire behind a heavy curtain while servants stoked the fire, though that didn't guarantee comfort. Castles were notoriously drafty, and even feather beds could feel like ice slabs in the winter months. Then there was the issue of sleep position. In the Middle Ages, lying completely flat on your back was associated with the dead. People often slept propped up, semi-reclined, with pillows or bolsters behind them. This had less to do with comfort and more to do with fear of death, fear of evil spirits, fear of choking. A good night's sleep, apparently, meant staying slightly vertical and slightly afraid. And speaking of fear, the night was thick with it. Darkness wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. Without electricity, nightfall was absolute. Most people refused to go out after sundown unless absolutely necessary. Tales of demons, witches, and ghosts were not just stories, they were survival mechanisms, reinforcing the belief that staying indoors was safest. Sleep was not a surrender, it was a truce negotiated with the unknown. Even beds themselves told a story. For most peasants, a bed was simply a heap of straw, perhaps laid atop a wooden frame or even just on the floor. The term hit the hay was quite literal, though many beds were more hay than hit. Over time, wealthier homes developed rope beds, which required regular tightening to stay firm. Hence, sleep tight, but let's not over-romanticize it. Without proper hygiene or regular mattress care, those beds were still havens for fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse. There was, however, a certain charm to these shared discomforts. Families huddled together, blankets pulled tight, listening to the wind howl through the eaves, the flicker of the hearth, the creak of the roof beams, the rhythmic breathing of a household asleep together. It may not have been luxurious, but it was human, raw, honest, and deeply connected. And while modern sleep is filled with blackout curtains, white noise machines, and sleep tracking apps that judge you from your wrist, their nights were filled with stories whispered in the dark, prayers muttered half asleep, and the occasional clatter of a chamber pot in the corner. Because in the medieval world, sleep wasn't a luxury or a science, it was just something you did to make it to morning. The night, for all its silence, was rarely still in medieval homes. Creaking beams, scratching rodents in the thatch above, the low whine of wind slipping through the shutter cracks, These were not distractions from sleep, but rather companions to it. And in this odd orchestra, the medieval sleeper did not lie alone in stoic silence. No, they snored, muttered, rolled, and sometimes, let's be honest, sweated heavily beneath woolen blankets shared with siblings, servants, or even the occasional stranger. Because privacy, dear modern listener, was not a medieval concern. In fact, the very concept of a private bedroom would have puzzled most peasants, and even a good number of nobles. Sleeping was a group activity. Entire families huddled together not just for warmth, but for security. Children curled around their parents like cats, grandparents croaked bedtime stories with gnarled fingers tracing symbols of saints into the dark. Husbands, wives, cousins, and the odd visiting merchant, everyone found their place on the straw-stuffed mattress or the hard-packed floor. But it gets stranger. Monasteries, for example, had regulated sleep patterns more rigid than a clock. Monks were awoken in the dead of night to chant, pray, and then return to sleep, only to rise again at dawn. It was sleep, interrupted by devotion, as if God himself were unwilling to let them slumber uninterrupted. Their habits weren't much softer than their beds, and even the act of lying down too comfortably could be considered a spiritual weakness. Then there were dreams, feared, revered, and interpreted like celestial telegrams. A dream of flying might be a divine vision. A dream of teeth falling out, perhaps a warning from the beyond. For medieval folk, dreams were more than brain static. They were prophecy, confession, or demonic trickery. Some even went to bed with relics under their pillows in the hope of warding off sinful dreams. Because nothing says restful sleep like a shard of a saint's femur nestled under your head. Sleepwalking, by the way, was another story. In the medieval mind, it wasn't merely a curious medical oddity. No, it could be a sign of possession. A somnambulist wandering through the village square might be dragged to the local priest for an exorcism before they'd had a chance to wake up. Which, frankly, sounds more terrifying than the sleepwalking itself. And when they weren't accusing each other of demonic sleep habits, they were worrying about night air. Yes, night air. It was believed to be inherently dangerous. Miasmas, bad humors, and unclean vapors floated in after dark, and the solution? Close the shutters tight, hang damp cloths over the windows, and for the love of all things holy, don't sleep too close to the fireplace. That's where the demons could slip in. Speaking of fireplaces, many slept near the hearth, especially in winter, not just for warmth, but because the house's only real heat source was often a single, dying flame. In wealthier homes, someone would even be assigned to keep the fire going through the night, essentially functioning as a human snooze button for the cold. And if you thought sleep was just something people did when the sun went down, think again. In the medieval world, particularly in Europe, there was something called first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for a few hours, wake up around midnight, do a bit of reading or praying or, yes, even socializing, and then go back to bed for their second round of slumber. Imagine getting up at 1 a.m. to write in your diary or chat with the neighbors. It wasn't insomnia, it was custom. This segmented sleep, by the way, made sense in a world without clocks, electricity, or TikTok. The night stretched long and eerie. 2 sleeps let people break up that darkness and squeeze in a bit of life between the yawns. And while doctors today may warn against screen time before bed, medieval folks were warned against demons, sin, and too much onion stew. In noble households, things weren't much more glamorous. Yes, the beds were raised, curtained, and possibly even stuffed with feathers. But the rooms were drafty, the chamber pots close by, and the servants, always nearby, sometimes slept at the foot of the bed like loyal dogs. A nobleman might retire behind his damask curtain, but he was rarely alone. Even royalty had to contend with the smell of chamber pots and the rustling of fleas. Ah yes, the fleas, and lice, and bedbugs. Sleep was rarely peaceful when you were sharing your pillow with an entire insect community. So many medieval people slept with caps on, not just to keep warm, but to keep the vermin from making nests in their hair. Romantic, isn't it? If you had a toothache, by the way, you might be advised to sleep with a frog in your mouth. No, I'm not making that up. It was believed the frog would absorb the pain. And if you had nightmares, you might be told to sleep with a knife under the bed to ward off witches. If the knife didn't work, maybe some dried wolf liver tied around your ankle would do the trick. And so the night marched on, full of creaking floorboards, whispered prayers, scratching vermin, and dreams that danced with angels or devils depending on what you'd eaten for supper. Sleep was a messy, shared, and often spiritually fraught experience. And if you woke up screaming from a nightmare, that was just your cue to light a candle, sip some warm beer, mutter a Hail Mary, and hope that the second sleep would be better than the first. By the time evening prayers were said and the hearth dimmed to embers, most medieval homes turned into cramped, snoring orchestras. Let's talk about sound, that oft-ignored bedfellow. The average medieval village didn't come with insulation, noise ordinances, or double-glazed windows. No, your bedtime lullaby might be a combination of pigs snorting outside, neighbors having a loud domestic disagreement through paper-thin wattle walls, or your child coughing in one corner while grandma talks to the saints in her sleep on the other side. Silence was a luxury, often reserved for the dead. And even graveyards weren't entirely peaceful. Between roaming animals and the occasional gravedigger doing overtime, not even the dead got undisturbed rest. Inside, it wasn't much better. In one-room cottages, everyone slept where there was room, in patterns that could only be described as practical, not comfortable. You might have a child sleeping on your feet, a cousin on your left, and a bucket nearby for nighttime necessities. Privacy was not only a foreign concept, it was simply not worth mentioning. If you were lucky enough to sleep in a curtained bed, that thin veil of linen was more ceremonial than effective. And then there was the question of dreams. Medieval folks had strong opinions on dreams. These weren't random firings of the subconscious, they were messages. Dreams came from God, from angels, from demons, or from that bad meat you ate 3 days ago. They were interpreted, feared, and sometimes recorded, especially by monks who had nothing better to do than ponder what it meant to see a goat on fire eating a manuscript in one's sleep. But not all sleep was idle. There was such a thing as spiritual sleep. Some monks were trained to sleep upright, in silence, supposedly communing with divine truth. In reality, it probably looked more like a very long, very slow nap while trying not to slump into a wall torch. Still, it beat sharing a bed with 3 snoring brothers and a curious mouse. And just when you thought it was safe to close your eyes, we arrive at the strange practice of sleep watching. Yes, watching others sleep. In wealthier households, servants sometimes stayed nearby in case their master needed anything during the night. Their job? Sit in the corner and watch. Quietly, patiently, perhaps staring into the dark, wondering what life decisions led them there. It was considered a form of loyalty, like being a medieval nightlight with ears. There's also the weird habit of night wandering. It wasn't uncommon for people to get up in the middle of the night and wander about, check on livestock, or even visit neighbors. No one found it especially odd if you knocked on someone's door at 2 a.m. to borrow a candle or discuss bread. In the world before alarm clocks, sleep wasn't so much a solid block as it was a series of naps interrupted by whatever life decided to throw at you. And if you were a student or scribe, night was prime time for copying manuscripts. Candlelight was bad for your eyes, but that didn't stop the parchment industry from thriving in monasteries after sundown. The scrape of quill on vellum echoed in the halls, paired with soft chants or the occasional yawn. Some monks even believed that copying texts while sleepy added a divine mysticism to the work, as though the Holy Spirit made up for spelling errors caused by exhaustion. Then there were night terrors, not the clinical kind, but the spiritual, society-wide variety. Nightmares were thought to be attacks by demons. You weren't just scared, you were possibly cursed. A bad dream could mean you'd offended a saint or forgotten to tithe properly. The solution: pray harder, or sleep with a relic under your pillow, preferably not too pointy. Amulets were big business. Little pouches of herbs, crosses carved from elderwood, and locks of hair from local holy people were all considered suitable sleep companions. You might go to bed looking like you were wearing half the village's lost and found bin. But hey, at least you were protected. Of course, some took more practical measures. Sleeping near garlic? Not just for cooking. Sleeping with iron objects kept the fairies out. Sleeping on a specific side prevented bad dreams. And if you turned over 3 times before lying down, well, congratulations. You were either cursed or just a very tired believer in bedtime rituals. As sleep patterns meandered through faith, fear, and function, so did the architecture. Castle bedrooms, if you could call them that, were often stone cold and drafty. No amount of tapestries could stop the chill of an 11th century breeze sneaking in through arrow slits. Royalty might have had grand beds, but they still piled on fur, feathers, and 10 layers of blankets just to not wake up frozen. And yet, the medieval world kept sleeping. Through famine, plague, and holy wars, people still closed their eyes, curled beside fires or animals or each other, and drifted into a world that was sometimes divine, sometimes terrifying, and always inconvenient. Up next, how one group of monks invented their own alarm clock. And no, it wasn't a rooster. Shall we drift onward? And then there were the bells. Yes, actual bells. Not the metaphorical kind that signal ideas in our modern minds, but real, clanging bells that tolled in the dark hours of early morning, summoning monks and peasants alike from their beds, or whatever passed for a bed back then. The medieval world was ruled not by clocks, but by rhythms, natural ones, seasonal ones, ecclesiastical ones. And in monasteries, which were often the centers of literacy, record-keeping, and what passed for punctuality, timekeeping was sacred. Monks observed the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, each associated with prayer, rest, and work. So, when the church bell rang out in the dead of night for matins, it wasn't optional. The bleary-eyed brethren would rise, shuffle through the freezing cloisters in silence, and chant praises into the cold, sometimes barefoot, often half asleep, always freezing. It wasn't only monks who danced to this nocturnal tune. Towns near abbeys could often hear the echoing chimes, and while commoners weren't expected to get up and pray, the bells still sliced through the silence of the night like a blade through frost. Sleep was communal, and so were its interruptions. You see, silence wasn't guaranteed. Dogs barked, cows mooed, roosters occasionally crowed at nothing. And the neighbors? Well, the walls were thin, and sometimes you heard them whisper or worse, snore. Privacy was a luxury. In a one-room cottage, you didn't go to bed alone unless you were spectacularly unpopular or very unlucky. Children, grandparents, even visiting neighbors might share a bed. Not because it was cozy, but because it was practical. More bodies meant more warmth, and fewer blankets meant more closeness. This created an intimacy modern sleep lacks, a kind of forced togetherness that blurred personal boundaries in the name of comfort. If you had a nightmare, chances were you'd whisper about it to someone beside you. If you stirred, you might accidentally elbow your cousin in the ribs. Snoring contests were real and nobody won. And if you think bedtime was just about sleep, think again. Some people believed that what you did before bed could influence your dreams, or even your fate. Prayers were whispered, yes, but also odd superstitions were observed. Hang rosemary by the door to keep demons out. Don't sleep with your head facing west, it invites death. Keep a piece of bread under your pillow to attract good dreams. And if you were a little more paranoid, you might leave your shoes pointing away from the bed, lest mischievous fairies get ideas. Now, let's talk about bedding. We've already established that mattresses were rarely plush, but here's something worse. They were alive. Feather beds were a luxury. Most people used straw mattresses or palliasse, and over time that straw attracted guests. Fleas, mites, lice, and let's not forget the occasional mouse. Every few weeks, the bedding was taken outside to be aired out, beaten with sticks, and refilled. It was housekeeping, yes, but also pest control. Still, people adapted. They scratched. They shared. They joked about it, well, at least the ones with a sense of humor did. It was just part of life. Sleeping with bugs wasn't delightful, but it was routine. Interestingly, in wealthier homes, bedding was a performance. The bed was the most expensive item in the room. It was draped with embroidered hangings, swaddled in wool, flanked by cushions. Not for comfort alone, but for display. If you were visiting a noble's chamber, you saw the bed. You admired it, and maybe, if you were lucky, you got to sleep in it, though probably not alone. Sleeping in the medieval world was not a private act. It was communal, practical, sometimes performative, occasionally spiritual, and always unpredictable. You might drift off with a prayer on your lips, a child's foot in your ribs, a lice stick nearby, and the soft rustle of straw beneath your back. Then, hours later, the bell might ring, calling someone, or everyone, into the dark. The cold never left. The sounds never stopped. But somehow people slept. Somehow, in the middle of a world without insulation, blackout curtains, or memory foam, they found rest. And perhaps that's the strangest thing of all. There was also the matter of bedding hierarchy, a deeply layered affair, literally and socially. The lord and lady of the manor, naturally, slept on the grandest bedding available. Thick feather mattresses, woolen underblankets, soft linen sheets, and a velvet or fur coverlet embroidered with family crests, saints, or biblical scenes. But even these elite beds weren't as soft and plush as we might imagine. Mattresses sagged quickly, feathers clumped, and dampness crept in through the stone floors despite the rush matting and wooden platforms. Below them, the servants would sleep on pallets stuffed with straw or dried leaves. These crackled and rustled with every shift of the body, which was less a nuisance and more of a built-in alarm system should any other servant or rodent creep by in the night. These lower beds were often shared, 2 or 3 to a pallet, heads pointing one way, feet the other, depending on the space and number of warm bodies available. You might wake up in the dark and forget entirely which elbow or foot belonged to whom. Peasants, of course, had even simpler arrangements. Their sleep often took place on woven mats, folded cloaks, or piles of hay directly on the floor, sometimes alongside their children, dogs, or goats. If you were lucky, you'd have a wooden platform slightly raised off the earthen floor. If not, your body absorbed the coolness of the ground, your only insulation being whatever woolen cloak or homespun blanket you could tuck around you. And let's not overlook the medieval obsession with sleep position, because yes, there was a correct and incorrect way to sleep. Lying flat on your back was considered not only bad for digestion but also spiritually dangerous. This position supposedly left you more vulnerable to demonic visitations or sinful thoughts. Side sleeping, particularly on the right side, was preferred. It was thought to aid the liver and align the body in a holy way, as many religious icons were depicted lying in repose this way. Monks, ever the paragons of discomfort for the sake of devotion, took this to the extreme. Many slept sitting upright, propped on narrow benches or leaning against wooden slats. Some even wore special belts or hair shirts, while they slept to ensure that rest didn't turn into indulgence. Sleep, after all, was a necessary evil, something to be managed carefully, never enjoyed too deeply. In some monasteries, monks weren't even allowed personal bedding. Communal dormitories had rows of stiff wooden platforms, separated only by thin curtains or wooden partitions. They were expected to wake multiple times in the night for prayer, matins, lauds, vigils, called forth by the clanging of a bell, which must have sounded like judgment itself in the inky pre-dawn cold. Now shift your mind to the world of the urban poor, medieval city dwellers in cramped quarters, where space was so limited that entire families might sleep in one room, one bed, or even alternating shifts. Day laborers and apprentices might rent a corner to sleep in, rather than a full room, laying their tired bodies down only after their employer had gone to bed. Privacy was a luxury, and nighttime noises, snoring, shuffling, coughing, whispering, were simply part of the sonic wallpaper of sleep. Then there's the seasonal factor. In summer, sleep moved outdoors when the heat of thick stone homes became unbearable. People slept on rooftops, in gardens, or beneath open windows. And in winter, people piled together like puppies beneath every available textile. Children might be nestled between adults, not only for warmth but also to prevent wandering off during fever dreams or sleepwalking episodes. Yes, medieval texts do mention night walking as a troublesome spirit or disorder. Speaking of sleep disorders, the medieval mind had an entire bestiary of sleep-related afflictions. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were considered real, physical events. A demon called the mare was believed to sit on your chest and suffocate you while you slept. This is actually where the word nightmare originates. People reported waking up paralyzed, breathless, and terrified, a phenomenon we now call sleep paralysis, but which the medieval sleeper chalked up to demonic visitations or angry ghosts. To guard against these terrors, people turned to charms, prayers, and sometimes more tactile solutions. A clove of garlic under the pillow, a small vial of holy water at the bedside, or iron scissors placed under the mattress, all common protections. Dream catchers, despite popular belief, are not medieval European, but their equivalents existed in the form of amulets or saints' medallions stitched into pillows. And then we must discuss the bed as a symbol not just of rest, but of lineage, inheritance, and status. A bed wasn't merely furniture, it was an heirloom. When a nobleman died, his bed was often listed first in his will, right alongside lands, armor, and livestock. A great bed might pass down for generations, its posts groaning under the collective dreams of an entire bloodline. Even among the commoners, a feather bed was a point of pride. Some newlyweds received one as a wedding gift, a status symbol as well as a practical blessing. Feather beds were so valuable that they were often mortgaged, traded, or passed down like currency. If your household couldn't afford one, you might still save up for a straw tick, which could be refilled yearly during harvest. And speaking of beds, the act of getting into one was also ritualized. It wasn't just a matter of flopping down in exhaustion. One had to prepare, don the proper night clothes or not, recite protective prayers, check for vermin, bank the fire, and hope the chimney wasn't hiding any witches or spirits. Children were tucked in beneath layers of wool and warned not to stick their toes out lest some curious imp tug them in the night. Candles were blown out with great care, both to conserve wax and to signal that the house was protected in darkness. In some households, the head of the family would make the sign of the cross over the flame before extinguishing it, a quiet invocation that sleep would come without mischief. And mischief, of course, had many forms. Sometimes it came in the shape of a rat skittering over your face. Other times it arrived as a flood of chamber pot odors wafting from the corner of the room. Or maybe it was just the persistent sound of your neighbor's toothless mother muttering in her dreams from across the thin wall. And yet, despite the discomforts, the lice, the fear of demons, the stiff backs and shared blankets, sleep was essential, unavoidable, and deeply woven into the rhythms of medieval life. Night was a boundary between worlds, day and dark, mortal and divine, waking and dream, and sleep, weird and wonderful as it was, held them all together. By the time we reached the heart of the medieval night, those haunting hours between midnight and cockcrow, we encounter a strange and forgotten custom, the second sleep. Yes, contrary to modern expectation, many medieval people did not sleep through the night in one continuous stretch. Instead, they often woke up in the middle of the night for an hour or more, a natural pause between what they called first sleep and second sleep. This wasn't considered insomnia. It was normal, even expected. Manuals on prayer, medical texts, and folk tales all casually mention this break in the night as though it were as standard as brushing your teeth. During this interlude, people might sit by the fire, reflect quietly, chat with their bedmate, pray, write, or even visit neighbors. A kind of twilight social hour under the stars and candlelight. Imagine the quiet of a home warmed by embers, where someone wakes, sits up in their straw mattress, lights a candle stub, and begins reading a psalter or murmuring whispered prayers. It was also a moment when people believed the boundary between the earthly and spiritual world grew thinner. The darkness after midnight held peculiar power. Witches, spirits, or angels were all thought to stir during this liminal space. In some superstitious households, amulets or holy relics might be touched or repositioned during this break to ensure a peaceful second sleep. The medical understanding of sleep also influenced this practice. Doctors and scholars of the time believed the body digested food better during first sleep, while the second half of the night was better for purging excess fluids or balancing humors. You were supposed to relieve yourself, stretch your limbs, perhaps even eat a light snack during the interval. Advice books from the period suggest not returning to bed too soon. Let your thoughts settle. Let the soul wander. Only then, sink into the second sleep, a more spiritual rest. Even in monasteries, where monks were expected to wake for midnight prayers, the structure of the night acknowledged this two-part slumber. The bells would ring sometime after midnight, drawing the monks from their hard wooden pallets to chant psalms in cold cloisters. They'd return to bed after matins, wrapping themselves again in silence and sleep. Imagine how this rhythm might have shaped people's dreams. First sleep might bring the vivid, food-fueled, earthy dreams of digestion and exhaustion. The second sleep, lighter, more spiritual, may have inspired visions, insights, or even prophetic dreams. Some scholars believe this natural biphasic sleep pattern better reflects how humans are biologically wired, especially in pre-electric light times. It's only modernity that pushed us into an 8-hour, uninterrupted block of unconsciousness. Interestingly, the language of dreams and visions in medieval texts often reflects this division. I dreamed in the second watch, or after I woke and returned to sleep, I saw, suggests a cultural fluency with sleep as a layered mystical process. Today, we might see this middle-of-the-night wakefulness as a problem to be medicated. But in the Middle Ages, it was a normal, even meaningful part of life. So picture a thatched cottage in a winter hamlet. The fire has long since burned low. The children are nestled like bundled turnips in their shared beds. The dogs sigh in the corner, and a mother wakes softly, sits up in her rough linen shift, reaches for a pot of goose grease or a wooden rosary, and begins her hour of midnight reverence, halfway between waking and dreaming. The only sound is the wind against the shutters and the crackle of a cooling hearth. And then, sometime later, she lies back down and drifts into her second sleep. No alarms, no clocks, just darkness and the pulse of time marked by the body's own rhythms. This strange two-act sleep may seem bizarre to us now, but it's just one more reminder that the medieval night was alive in ways we no longer understand. The darkness then wasn't just the absence of light. It was a space for reflection, wonder, fear, and intimacy. A time when waking up didn't mean something was wrong. It meant you were simply living as people had lived for centuries. And yet, even if you had a bed, and even if it wasn't full of fleas or brothers or your cousin's goat, there was still the question of the mattress itself. Or should we say, the lump collection. A mattress, in the medieval sense, was really more of a canvas sack stuffed with anything that looked vaguely soft: straw, hay, rags, moss, or if you were feeling fancy, feathers, though these tended to leak dramatically at all the wrong moments. Imagine dozing off only to awaken with a feather poking your ear canal, like an avian dentist gone rogue. Mattresses had to be plumped and rotated frequently, unless, of course, you preferred sleeping on what felt like a sack of old turnips. Some people added herbs to the stuffing. Not for comfort, mind you, but to keep the smells tolerable. Lavender, wormwood, and rosemary were common picks, though one suspects that after a few nights, not even the Blessed Virgin herself could have purified the stench of damp moss mixed with human sweat. Now, this might surprise you. Many medieval folks didn't sleep lying flat. That was suspicious. Lying flat was for the dead, so beds were often sloped, angled, or even set up with the head raised. Sleeping sitting up, propped against a pile of pillows or the wooden headboard, was not just common but considered safer. You wouldn't want blood rushing to your head. After all, that might make you sick, or worse, Catholic. And speaking of sickness, let us not forget the nightcap. Not the sherry kind, unfortunately, but the literal cap for your head. You see, medieval homes were not known for insulation. Most windows were unglazed, and even the ones with animal horn panes let in wind like a nosy ghost. So one slept in full attire, tunic, stockings, maybe even shoes, and a little cloth hat tied under the chin like a bonnet worn by a very tired executioner. Nightcaps served more than just warmth. They also covered lice-bitten scalps and kept longer hair from getting tangled in your bedfellow's beard or your straw mattress. And if you were really lucky or noble, you had a canopy overhead, not for romance, but to keep the rats from falling on your face in the middle of the night. Truly, romance was in the air, and so were rodents. Then there's the phenomenon of night stools. These were not the relaxing kind of stools, no. They were, in fact, chamber pots, and they lived under your bed like a porcelain troll waiting to be summoned. Midnight trips to the outhouse? Not in the freezing dark, thank you very much. You did your business in the bowl and hoped the lid stayed on tight. Woe to the man who kicked it in his sleep, or the servant who had to empty it by morning. Privacy, too, was largely a myth. If you were wealthy, you might sleep in a curtained bed, though not always alone. Married couples frequently shared beds with their children, servants, and guests. It was considered both practical and moral, because what's more virtuous than sharing your dreams with someone who snores like a dying pig? And for the poor, privacy was a joke best told over stale ale. Entire families often slept in one bed, or a straw heap in the corner. The concept of personal space simply didn't exist. Your mother, your brother, your goat, they all had dreams, and you were going to hear them. Literally. Sleepwalking was another oddity. In a world governed by superstition, if someone wandered around at night muttering, it wasn't called a sleep disorder. It was either a divine message or evidence of demonic possession. Either way, the remedy was simple. A healthy splash of holy water, a few prayers, and perhaps chaining the door shut for everyone's peace of mind. Dreams themselves were taken quite seriously. They weren't just fragments of memory or idle imagination. They were signs, omens, warnings. If you dreamed of falling, it might mean you were about to lose your fortune. If you dreamed of teeth falling out, congratulations, you were likely to die. Freud would have had a field day with the medieval mind, but unfortunately, he wouldn't be born for a few hundred years. And in the meantime, peasants just coped the best they could, with herbs, and maybe a stiff drink. Speaking of drinks, ale was often consumed before bed, sometimes even instead of water. Medieval water was famously unreliable. Drinking it could result in dysentery or worse. So, people turned to small ale, a weak beer, low in alcohol, safe enough for children and just strong enough to make you sleep through your neighbor's night coughs. It was the medieval equivalent of warm milk with a sedative twist. Now imagine this. You're in a wooden house with a thatched roof. Your mattress smells like old goat and lavender. Your chamber pot is ominously close, and your little brother keeps kicking you in the spleen. But outside, the wolves are howling. The wind is whistling through the cracks in the walls. And you're alive, in the warm pile of humanity that is your family, pressed together like a badly stacked laundry load, dreaming strange dreams beneath the sacred eyes of saints carved in walnut. Oddly enough, it worked. People survived. They adapted. They made rituals, said prayers, hung charms, and whispered stories before bed. Fairy tales that were more cautionary than comforting, filled with witches, woods, and wolves. Sleep was never a guarantee. It was a crossing, a journey into the unknown, a vulnerability, and that's perhaps the strangest thing of all. How despite the discomfort, the lice, the drafts, and the dubious company, people still managed to sleep, to wake, to dream, to carry on. While most of us today take for granted the idea of locking the door, switching off the lights, and peacefully drifting into oblivion, the medieval world wasn't quite so restful. Safety at night was a gamble, and so many households, especially in towns or border regions, relied on rotating night watchers. No, not guards in shining armor patrolling the parapets, but ordinary people. Apprentices, older children, even servants, tasked with staying semi-awake through the night to keep an ear out for danger. In wealthier homes, these watchers might sit on a wooden bench by the main door or even just lay near it, wrapped in a scratchy woolen blanket, clutching a club or torch, listening for thieves, wolves, or worse. They were the first line of defense between the sleeping household and the unpredictable outside world. Every creak was investigated. Every dog's bark in the distance was noted. And if something went wrong, well, they were expected to raise the alarm, ideally without getting themselves killed first. In poorer homes, the job often fell to whoever had the misfortune of sleeping closest to the entrance. There was no rotation, no schedule, just an unspoken rule. Light sleepers near the door, heavy sleepers in the middle, and the babies under the covers so they wouldn't freeze or disappear in the night. But even villages had their versions of this. Community watches were sometimes organized, especially after a few bad years of banditry or war. Men would take turns patrolling the lanes and checking on neighbors. It was less about heroic vigilance and more about trudging around in the cold, half asleep, trying not to step in anything nasty. The anxiety of sleeping too deeply was a real concern. Many people believed that nighttime was when evil spirits were strongest. If you slept too heavily, you might miss your only chance to protect yourself or your family. Some carried charms or protective herbs in little pouches under their pillows or tied to their bedpost. Others whispered prayers or recited protective psalms before lying down, not because they were devout, but because they were scared. Now, imagine trying to get quality rest with someone rustling around the room at intervals, poking the fire, muttering to themselves, or responding to noises outside. And if the watcher fell asleep, well, the next morning's bread might be missing, or worse, the family pig. Yes, pig theft was a nightly risk, and nothing ruined a medieval breakfast quite like finding out your breakfast had trotted away in the night. Some inns took a more organized approach. They hired actual night watchmen, grizzled fellows with staves who patrolled the common rooms and stables, sometimes shouting the hour or singing crude rhymes to announce their presence. One account from a 14th century traveler mentions being woken at regular intervals by a nightman shouting, "It is now past midnight, and the stars are cold," which, to be fair, sounds poetic until it breaks your sleep for the 4th time in one night. Others had communal alarms. Cowbells tied to doors, dogs trained to bark at shadows, or even primitive rattles to scare off intruders. Of course, sometimes the greatest danger was already inside. Drunken neighbors, overworked servants, restless children. The medieval household was not a quiet place after dark. Still, being a night watcher came with a strange sort of pride. They were the ones who kept the household safe, who endured the drafts and eerie noises, who made sure that when dawn broke, everyone was still alive and the chickens hadn't been spirited away. And on those long, silent nights when nothing happened, when the stars hung motionless and the frost clung to every beam, they might have even felt a touch of peace. A strange sort of quiet, broken only by the soft breath of the sleeping family, the distant hoot of an owl, or the crackling of dying embers in the hearth. It was in those moments that the night watcher became the silent soul of the home, eyes open while the world dared to dream. Let's now wander into the tangled superstitions that tucked themselves between the bed sheets of the medieval world. You see, sleep was never simply a matter of rest. It was a battlefield between good and evil, light and dark, spirit and soul. In many European villages, the belief persisted that your soul temporarily left your body during sleep. Yes, like a ghost on a vacation, which meant, of course, that anything could happen to you while your soul was out and about, especially if it decided not to return. Naturally, this made people extremely wary of being woken suddenly. To do so wasn't just rude, it was spiritual sabotage. This fear gave birth to strange customs. Some families placed shoes at the foot of the bed pointing outward, so their souls would know the way back home. Others sprinkled salt under the mattress or hung protective herbs like mugwort above the bed to guard the empty body. And don't even think about sleeping with your feet toward the door. This was said to tempt death itself to drag you away. since it mimicked how corpses were laid out before burial. Then there were the night demons. Chief among them was the nightmare, a creature who crept into sleeping chambers and sat on a person's chest, crushing the breath out of them. The name of this creature is where we get the word nightmare. If you woke up gasping, paralyzed, heart racing, it wasn't anxiety or sleep paralysis. It was a demonic horsewoman riding your ribcage. Naturally, to prevent these visits, many people kept small objects under their pillows. Iron was a favorite. Nails, scissors, knives, anything forged, believed to repel evil. In some regions, children were tucked in with pieces of bread, which sounds oddly charming until you remember it was meant to feed any visiting spirits so they wouldn't feed on you instead. Practical. Speaking of children, they were often the most protected sleepers in the household. A baby's cradle might be encircled in protective charms, or even drawn in chalk outlines to ward off spirits. Baptism wasn't just a religious rite, it was a shield. Unbaptized children were considered particularly vulnerable to being swapped out by fairies. Yes, swapped. You'd put your baby down, and a sly woodland spirit would leave a changeling in its place. Sickly, quiet, or too clever by half. To test this theory, some folklore advised leaving out ale and a hot poker. If the baby reacted oddly, suddenly speaking or recoiling from the iron, you had a fairy imposter. The solution: threatened to throw the changeling into the fire. Apparently, this would terrify the fairy enough to return the original child. Disturbing? Absolutely. But it reveals how deeply magical thinking shaped sleep-time routines. Even adults weren't immune to these stories. A man who woke too late from his second sleep might claim he'd been hag-ridden. This meant a witch had come in the night and ridden his body like a horse, leaving him sore and exhausted. Women, meanwhile, were sometimes accused of becoming night creatures themselves, flying from their beds as owls, cats, or wisps of smoke to attend midnight sabbaths. There were even tales of the Alp in Germanic folklore, a mischievous entity that slipped through keyholes or cracks and perched on the sleeper's chest. Unlike demons, the Alp wasn't necessarily evil, just moody, sometimes comical, but always deeply inconvenient. Garlic and bright light were the supposed antidotes, which is why some people went to bed with a candle still burning or a clove of garlic strung above the doorway. All of this sounds like fantasy, until you remember that in the silence of a medieval night, with the fire reduced to embers and no streetlights, no hum of traffic, and every creak echoing like a footstep, it was easy to believe in such things. The brain, deprived of stimuli and full of inherited superstition, was the perfect cauldron for imagined horrors. And sleep, rather than a peaceful retreat, became an arena. To sleep in the medieval world was to risk everything. Not just your safety, but your soul. And so people guarded their dreams with salt and iron, with prayers and herbs, with whispered stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The bedroom was not a sanctuary, it was a threshold. And what lurked on the other side of that threshold was both invisible and deeply personal. Some even believed that dreams themselves could be prophetic or sent by spirits. A particularly vivid nightmare might prompt a visit to the local wise woman or priest to interpret the symbols and decipher what it all meant. Was it a warning? A message from a dead relative? A sign of sin? Better to know than to ignore. Better to prepare than to perish in your sleep, body cold and soul adrift. Sleep, in short, was rarely boring. Even when the body lay still, the mind danced with dread. And the rituals that grew up around bedtime were less about comfort and more about survival. Because in a world ruled by mystery, you never really slept alone. In a small medieval hamlet where winters came early and overstayed their welcome, the act of getting ready for sleep wasn't something done with ease. It was a battle waged nightly. And not just against the cold or fleas or the neighbor's drunken snoring, but against the ticking rhythm of one's own body. Because in this part of the world, long before melatonin supplements or sleep podcasts whispered by softly accented voices, the people believed sleep could be broken, and not just once. They called it first sleep and second sleep. Not an insomnia-induced curse, but rather the expected way of things. You'd go to sleep shortly after sundown, around 8 or 9 p.m., bundled in a wool-stuffed mattress, wrapped in whatever scratchy linens hadn't yet grown mold. Then, like clockwork, you'd wake up again a few hours later, around midnight or so, and you wouldn't panic. You wouldn't scroll through a candlelit version of Twitter. No, you'd simply get up for an hour, maybe two. What did medieval people do during this mysterious interlude? The list was long and surprisingly cozy. You might throw another log on the fire. You might grab a snack, bread and cheese if you were lucky, dried peas or cold pottage if you weren't. If you had a partner, this was considered a prime time for a little marital bonding. Monks might pray, farmers might think through their crop rotations, and the lonely might simply stare into the flickering light, wrapped in furs, contemplating their sins, or perhaps the lice crawling slowly down the hem of their neighbor's tunic. The notion of segmented sleep wasn't bizarre, it was accepted. A rhythm shaped by candlelight, seasonal labor, and the natural dips in body temperature during the night. Physicians wrote about it, priests sermonized around it, and poets romanticized it. It was, in their eyes, the divine interval, a built-in pause for reflection, prayer, or a casual conversation with one's spouse about the goat that wouldn't stop bleeding last Thursday. But when the church took firmer control of daily schedules, enforcing matins and lauds, vigils and vespers, the free flow of segmented sleep began to be absorbed by stricter routines. Sleep began to bend toward the monastic bell, not the natural darkness. Eventually, even peasants started sleeping through the night in one continuous groggy stretch, like the rest of us poor modern creatures. Still, the idea never fully died out. In winter, especially, when nights stretched long and candles burned short, villagers still often found themselves wide awake at midnight. Not afraid, not anxious, just aware that the night was long enough to be divided, and that maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to fight it. Of course, the nobility had their own strange ways of passing that midnight interval. Wealthy lords might wander their halls, wrapped in fine furs, inspecting their hearths and pretending to care about the servants who froze behind the walls. Ladies might pick up embroidery, using the quiet time to stitch a few crooked crosses onto a handkerchief for a cousin they couldn't stand. Or more scandalously, one might tiptoe off to another chamber entirely, guided by the flicker of a torch and the promise of a warm bed shared with someone slightly less legally sanctioned. There were even herbal remedies recommended specifically for the waking period between sleeps. A mild tea of valerian, lavender, or poppy might help coax you gently back into the second phase. Or if you were truly desperate, you might turn to more curious solutions, like binding a pouch of crushed mouse bones to your chest or sleeping with an onion beneath your pillow to ward off restless spirits. Let's not pretend the second sleep was always a peaceful return. Sometimes it didn't come at all. Sometimes the pigs got loose. Sometimes someone snored loud enough to rattle the shingles. Sometimes you just lay there, eyes open, swaddled in rough wool, wondering what on earth that scratching noise was above your head. Spoiler, it was rats. It was always rats. Still, the notion of sleep as a two-act performance remained part of the medieval rhythm. They didn't expect to sleep like logs. They slept like people navigating a world full of uncertainty, light, noise, cold, and spiritual obligation. And they did so with a flexibility modern life rarely allows. In some ways, they might have handled their strange nights better than we do now. Instead of fighting the wakeful hour, they welcomed it. They embraced it. They let the darkness stretch and breathe, allowed their minds to wander without guilt. No shame. No blue light, no need for melatonin gummy bears, just the long, slow drift from one half of night to the other. You may be surprised to learn that many medieval people didn't sleep in the way we define a full night's sleep today. We touched on first and second sleeps, but there were even stranger nighttime activities waiting in the twilight hours between them. One particularly weird practice? Midnight chatting. That's right. Conversations in the middle of the night weren't a sign of insomnia or distraction. They were normal, expected, sometimes even planned. After the first sleep, which often lasted from dusk until about midnight, people would awaken naturally. Not with alarm clocks, of course, but with internal rhythms and the slight discomfort of a straw mattress. The house would remain dark except for the orange glow of the hearth, but people would sit up, pray, stoke the fire, or whisper to their bedmates about the day ahead, or the dreams they just had. It was a pause, a holy pause, some called it. A quiet moment to exist between the burdens of yesterday and the fatigue of tomorrow. Sometimes couples used this time to be intimate. Others used it to sneak out and check on livestock, draw water, or even walk to neighbors' homes. Yes, if you were really lucky, your neighbor might knock on your door with a jug of ale and some idle gossip at 1 a.m. Because why not? They were up too, and there were no phones to scroll or Netflix to binge. Socializing by firelight was the medieval equivalent of late-night texting. This waking period might last an hour or two, or more, depending on the season, how cold it was, or how restless someone felt. Eventually, the second sleep would begin, carrying the sleeper into early morning. This idea of split sleep wasn't considered a problem. It was simply how the body was meant to rest, or at least how it adapted to candlelit darkness and the slow movement of time. But then there were other sleep arrangements that went beyond just the weird and wandered straight into the wonderfully impractical. Monks, for instance, had their own strange bedtime choreography. In some orders, they were required to rise every night around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. for matins, a form of early morning prayer. These monks would wake from deep slumber, stumble into the chilly darkness, wrap themselves in thick woolen cloaks, and shuffle into stone chapels where the air hung cold and wet like a damp rag. They would chant in Latin, half asleep, their voices rising in breathy harmony, forming a kind of lullaby for the soul. Then, after prayers, they'd return to their pallets, stiff, narrow bedding laid out in communal dormitories, and try to catch another few hours of sleep before the sun officially called them to labor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was holy. It wasn't restful, but it was rhythmic. And if you weren't a monk or a noble, but rather a peasant woman with an infant, your sleep was another story entirely. Mothers often co-slept with babies, not because of modern parenting trends, but because it was the only practical way to keep a baby warm and fed in the middle of a freezing night. These women often slept in shift dresses, with their children tucked under armpits or blankets made from patched wool. It wasn't just nurturing, it was survival. They learned to nurse half asleep, to listen for coughs and creaks even in slumber, and to stretch their bodies like shields across straw mattresses to block out cold air sneaking through the thatch. Many sang lullabies with lyrics that would unsettle a modern listener, songs about demons, dark woods, and creatures that came for children who didn't sleep. Comfort, with a sprinkle of nightmare. In some households, especially poorer ones, the fireplace embers were the only source of heat, so beds were arranged as close to it as possible. If you were last in the birth order, too bad, you were likely sleeping on the coldest side of the bed, sometimes in shifts, sometimes on the floor, sometimes under the table. In fact, the kitchen table might be flipped and used as a makeshift lean-to, trapping warm air underneath like a crude fort. And inside this wooden shell, children and small animals might sleep side by side, wrapping themselves in cloaks, sacks, or even each other. Sleep was not private. It wasn't luxurious, and it definitely wasn't uninterrupted. It was something caught between hunger and cold, duty and dream, a state to be managed, not indulged, a necessity bent around the rhythms of a medieval world that didn't care how tired you felt. We often romanticize the past as simpler, slower, easier, but when it comes to medieval sleep, the truth is colder, stranger, and filled with half-silent prayers, drafty barns, communal beds, and the uncomfortable knowledge that darkness lasted much longer than it does now. And yet, for all its oddities, there was a kind of poetry to the way people rested, the way sleep was shared, broken, reassembled, as if dreaming itself was just another task to be worked into the fabric of daily survival, woven between bells and firelight, between muttered Latin and the soft crackle of a dying log. Sleep, back then, was not escape. It was surrender. By now, the candles would be burning low. In the coldest stone cottages, the breath of those sleeping curled like mist into the rafters. But no one truly believed they were alone. Not in the dark, not in the medieval world. The silence after sunset was never quite empty. It was filled with whispers, real or imagined, creaking beams, wind slipping through wooden shutters, or something older still. Sleep wasn't just a physical act. It was a ritual of protection, an act of faith, and sometimes a negotiation. For many medieval folk, especially in Northern Europe, the night was a spiritual gauntlet. You didn't simply go to bed. You guarded your soul as it wandered in sleep, because while your body rested, it was believed your spirit could drift, freely, vulnerably, through dreams and darkness. To protect against this, people relied on what we might call sleep charms. These weren't necessarily magic in the high fantasy sense. They were protective measures, whispered prayers, knotted threads, verses from scripture, or runes carved into wooden bed frames. One popular charm was the Four Corners Blessing, a rhyme spoken while pointing to each bedpost. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. Not just poetic, but deeply defensive. It was a spiritual perimeter, heavenly bodyguards, as it were. And while Christianity shaped many nightly rituals, older traditions remained tucked beneath the sheets. In Scandinavia, it was believed that night spirits, such as the mare, which would sit on your chest and bring nightmares, could be warded off with iron scissors under the pillow, or placing shoes pointing opposite directions under the bed. A subtle message to confuse and deter malevolent visitors. Some believed that keeping a bit of bread by your bedside could ward off witches. Bread, oddly, had power, representing life, sustenance, and sanctity. Others kept bells, amulets, or even a sprig of rosemary nearby. Herbs weren't just for cooking. They guarded your dreams, scented your sleep, and stood sentinel over the unconscious hours. There were also spoken incantations, passed down in hushed voices. In parts of medieval Wales and Cornwall, people would whisper blessings over children to protect them from night stealing, a belief that fairies or spirits might snatch a sleeping soul. To prevent this, they'd recite charms in a sing-song cadence, soft enough to blend with the crackle of the hearth. Even the direction your bed faced mattered. Lying with your head to the east was ideal. It aligned with the rising sun and symbolized life. But sleeping with your feet facing the door? That was an omen of death. Corpses were carried out feet first. You didn't tempt fate by mimicking their path. And speaking of death, the line between sleep and the eternal slumber was often seen as perilously thin. The phrase "sleep like the dead" wasn't always metaphorical. People were wary of slipping too deeply into unconsciousness. Especially during plagues or long winters, the cold could take someone in their sleep without struggle. The morning wake-up wasn't taken for granted. It was a small resurrection. This fear gave rise to death watches. In some areas, the elderly or sick weren't left alone at night. Someone would sit nearby, quietly praying, keeping the fire alive, and ensuring that the sleeper didn't drift too far. If they did pass, the watch ensured they wouldn't go unnoticed or unattended. Sleep, in this light, was never entirely peaceful. It was always a crossing, with some risk of not returning. And of course, there were dreams. Medieval people didn't dismiss them as brain static. Dreams were divine, prophetic, or dangerous. Entire manuals were written interpreting them. Dreamed of running water? That might mean gossip. Dreamed of a lion? Perhaps God was watching. Dreamed of teeth falling out? Illness or bad fortune loomed. People kept dream diaries, on scraps of parchment, if they could write, or recounted them aloud at breakfast. Even peasants discussed dreams in the fields. A good dream could carry hope through a hard day. A bad one might require a visit to the local wise woman or priest. In Italy, some communities believed that a dream of fire meant a wedding was coming. In France, dreaming of snakes meant betrayal. In Iceland, A dream of icy storms could mean a death in the family. These weren't just idle interpretations. They were taken as warnings, guides, and, sometimes, curses. The weight of the spiritual world pressed against every pillow. The night was alive with meanings, signs, and unseen things. To sleep was to surrender, to trust that the charms tucked under your pillow, the whispered words at your bedside, and the smoke of sacred herbs might be enough to keep you safe. And in this eerie calm, there was a strange kind of comfort. To be surrounded by ritual, to believe that protection was possible, that even in a world full of uncertainty, you had a say in how you slept. Whether it was rosemary or rhythm, scripture or superstition, medieval people wrapped themselves in defenses before sinking into dreams. They knew the dark wasn't empty. It was waiting, and sleep wasn't just an escape, it was an act of courage. In the hushed silence of cloisters and abbeys, where stone walls echoed with whispered prayers and flickering candlelight was the only rebellion against the darkness, sleep was a curious combination of divine discipline and physical endurance. Monks, unlike peasants or nobles, didn't simply lie down and hope for dreams. They scheduled their sleep, dividing the night like a loaf of bread shared among many duties, ensuring none was too generous or too indulgent. At the heart of this sacred routine was the practice of the canonical hours, fixed moments of prayer throughout the day and, importantly, the night. Nighttime was not a long, unbroken sleep for the devout. It was divided by the call of the bells, tolling gently or ominously, depending on one's level of exhaustion. At midnight or shortly after came matins or vigils. The monks would rise from their straw mattresses or hard wooden cots, wrapped in coarse habits, feet chilled by the stone floor, and shuffle toward the chapel. Sleep was paused, and the voice of God took precedence. These gatherings were not brief. They could last up to 2 hours, filled with chants, scripture readings, and whispered recitations in Latin. Some monks dozed during these services, swaying gently, heads bowed. Whether in reverence or sleep was anyone's guess. Older monks developed the art of napping while kneeling, which, if nothing else, saved time. After matins, the monks would return to their dormitories for a second bout of rest, what modern scholars call segmented or biphasic sleep. A first sleep, then prayer, then a second sleep until dawn. In truth, medieval monks were among the earliest practitioners of what modern sleep scientists would later rediscover. That human sleep might naturally favor division into 2 periods, with a gap of wakefulness in the middle. But while monks had the clockwork of bells to rouse them, in small village churches, the system was less reliable. Parish priests, often alone, had to maintain their own discipline. Some would sleep in the church itself, near the altar, especially in cold seasons. Others rotated duties, with deacons responsible for keeping time, and frequently failing to do so. In wealthier abbeys, lay brothers might serve the monks by ensuring the chapel was warmed before midnight prayers, or by shaking those who didn't stir with the first bell. Discipline varied. In some Benedictine orders, punishment for missing matins included fasting or additional chores, because nothing motivates spiritual rigor like scrubbing communal latrines in winter. Women in religious life, nuns and anchoresses, followed similar routines. Enclosed in convents or walled into anchor holds, tiny one-room cells attached to churches, they too split their sleep around prayer. Anchoresses, who lived their entire lives in a single stone room, were expected to keep the hours just as the monks did, rising in the dark to pray with no bell but their internal clock, and no company but the mice. Outside of monastic life, churches shaped sleep habits too. Bells rang out across towns and villages, not just to signal prayer, but also to mark curfew. The couvre-feu in French, from which we get the word curfew, instructed households to cover fires and retire. The tolling bell at evening, often 8 or 9 p.m., was the official invitation to bedtime, especially in towns where fire risk was high and street wandering after dark was frowned upon, if not outright punished. And then, of course, came the dawn bell, the wake-up call for the entire community. In some places, this early bell was nicknamed the knocker-upper long before people paid someone to bang on their window with a pole. The church provided structure, rhythm, and a kind of collective alarm system long before electricity and wristwatches. Yet not everyone slept peacefully. Some feared the night as a time of demonic visitations or spiritual vulnerability. Sleeping too deeply was sometimes viewed as dangerous to the soul. There were tales of monks being visited by demons in their dreams or spirits whispering during matins. The dark wasn't just absence of light, it was presence of something else entirely. Something watching, something waiting. To safeguard their sleep, monks might place crosses above their beds or recite prayers for protection. Psalm 91 was a favorite. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night. And truly, terror wasn't always metaphorical. Rats, bedbugs, freezing drafts, or the occasional wandering madman could turn a night into a trial. Still, among the routine and ritual there was a strange peace. A life so structured that even sleep had its appointed time, its proper interruptions, and its holy purpose. Monks were taught that sleep, when done right, could be an act of obedience, not indulgence. The goal wasn't comfort, but humility, not dreams, but discipline. And in that quiet, candlelit world, shaped by bells and psalms, the medieval monastic sleeper learned to rest not for themselves, but for God. Not for escape, but for readiness. Always ready for the next bell, the next chant, the next waking. Because in the medieval cloister, even sleep was a form of prayer. Long after the world had tucked itself in, the medieval household often stirred back to life. Not for pleasure, but for practicality. Life didn't allow for neat 8-hour stretches of slumber. Instead, people often slept in two separate shifts. The first sleep, which began after dusk, and the second sleep, which commenced after a midnight interlude. And what did they do during this eerie interval between sleeps? You might imagine poetry or prayer. And yes, sometimes, but more often it was chores, because of course it was. This in-between time, known simply as the watch, saw people rising from bed, stretching out their aching backs, and quietly getting to work. Women might tend to spinning or mending, illuminated by nothing more than a sputtering tallow candle. Men might head outside to check on livestock or relieve themselves in the freezing night air. A few crept to neighbors' homes for illicit trysts, shielded by the veil of darkness. Not exactly romantic, but definitely medieval. This wasn't some rare phenomenon. It was completely normal to break sleep and engage in life for an hour or two. People even wrote about it casually in letters or diaries, as if saying, woke up after first sleep, sharpened the scythe, back to bed. The modern 8-hour uninterrupted sleep cycle? That's a relatively recent invention, courtesy of electric lighting and the Industrial Revolution. The medieval brain operated on candlelight and superstition. But between those waking intervals and second sleeps, other nightly fears crept in. Because if you weren't careful during that midnight wakefulness, your thoughts could wander. You might hear the howl of a wolf in the forest or the creak of wood in a cold, settling house. Or worse, you might hear nothing, just the still, heavy silence that made peasants suspect something was near, something they couldn't see. Superstition filled the silence. In some regions, people believed that waking between sleeps made you more susceptible to demonic visitations. Others claimed that midnight was when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. The air at that hour was thick with dread and mystery. To wake up in the dead of night was natural, yes, but it was also a spiritual risk. That's why it wasn't uncommon for people to whisper prayers during their wakeful hours, or to sprinkle holy water at the threshold of their homes before lying down again. Doors were bolted, crosses hung above the bedstead. Some households even burned specific herbs to ward off the spirits. Sleep, after all, was a vulnerable state, and in the medieval imagination, one never knew what might sneak in through a dream or crack in the doorframe. Then there were the dreams themselves. People didn't think of dreams as subconscious metaphors or neural static like we do now. They thought of them as messages, divine or demonic. A good dream could be a sign of favor from God. A terrifying one might mean a curse was coming. Some even believed the devil could whisper temptations directly into the ear during slumber. So a strange dream wasn't brushed off. It was pondered, confessed, or feared. And the physical space of the bed didn't help with restfulness either. The mattress, likely a rough sack of straw or old feathers, sat atop ropes or planks. These ropes needed tightening every so often, hence the phrase sleep tight. Bugs and vermin also loved these rustic sleeping arrangements. Bed bugs, fleas, and the occasional mouse might join you uninvited. It's not surprising that people rose at midnight. Who could blame them? The longer you look at medieval sleep, the more it begins to resemble a fragmented, anxious thing. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was broken, cluttered with tasks, haunted by fears, interrupted by livestock, punctuated by cold, and often shared with lice, siblings, or both. Privacy was rare. Silence was eerie. Comfort was a fantasy. And yet, somehow, people managed to function, or at least survive. In the wealthier homes, things were slightly better, but only slightly. Lords and ladies might enjoy softer bedding, embroidered sheets, or thick furs to keep warm. But they too feared the night, and they too woke up at odd hours. It wasn't the peasant's curse. It was the shared condition of pre-modern humanity. A monk might wake to chant nocturnes, whispering Latin verses under flickering oil lamps. A baker might rise to knead dough under the stars. A midwife might be summoned to a nearby hovel, stepping barefoot into a nightmare of childbirth by candlelight. And somewhere, a child might wake crying, only to be soothed back to sleep with a lullaby passed down for generations. It was all normal. That was the strange part. None of this was remarkable to them. To live in constant low-level discomfort and fear, to think of dreams as omens, to share a bed with an entire family and a few insects, it was life, and they accepted it night after fragmented night. So as you lie there now, adjusting your pillow, listening to the gentle hum of a fan or the distant sound of a car passing by, remember this. Medieval people slept, just not the way we do. They rose when the moon was high, carried out tasks in the dark, prayed against things they couldn't name, and crawled back under blankets made of rough wool, grateful to survive another night. And still, somehow, they dreamed. And then, when you thought medieval sleep couldn't possibly become more absurd, we must take a brief detour into the world of medieval dream interpretation, a final bedtime oddity that should give your own dreams a little extra flavor tonight. In medieval Europe, dreams weren't just brain static or random subconscious firings. No, dreams were practically divine telegrams, delivered nightly by angels, demons, or your local saint on duty. The average person might dream of falling, and instead of brushing it off, they'd spend the next day asking their village priest if it meant they were going to hell, or perhaps just needed to stop stealing goose eggs. Books of dream interpretation, such as the widely circulated Somnial Danielis, offered intricate dictionaries of dream meanings. To dream of bread meant prosperity. To dream of climbing a ladder meant spiritual advancement, or, depending on the direction, spiritual failure. Dreaming of fire? That could mean lust, or heresy, or indigestion. Interpret carefully. Monks often wrote down their dreams in detailed journals. Why wouldn't they? They had the time, the parchment, and more repressed thoughts than most towns could contain. Some even tried dream fasting, a practice of denying food and water to summon purer dreams, which sounds suspiciously like the medieval version of taking melatonin on an empty stomach and hoping for the best. But dreams were not only private affairs. Entire court decisions and political alliances were once swayed by who dreamed what. One noblewoman claimed the Virgin Mary appeared in her dream and told her which cousin to marry. Convenient. Another man claimed he dreamed of a lion speaking Latin, warning him not to sign a certain land treaty. Was he drunk on mead or just deeply spiritual? Who can say? And so it continued, sleep as a portal, a puzzle, and occasionally a legal document. When night fell across the thatched rooftops and flickering torchlight faded from castle halls and village squares, medieval people turned not just to beds or straw or floorboards, but to rituals and relics, superstition, and soothed paranoia. They tied herbs around their necks, whispered prayers into the dark, shared furs with pigs, and waited, half-waking, for dawn. For them, sleep was not a given. It was an act of will, a social event, a divine gamble. And so now, as our strange journey through medieval sleep draws to a close, and the last candle burns low in your mind's eye, perhaps you'll carry a little of their world into your own quiet hours. You might not sleep in shifts or rub bat brains on your temples, but next time you dream of a ladder or a lion, well, don't say they didn't warn you. Now rest, if you can, knowing you've survived the night in the medieval world, at least in imagination. Sleep tight, and maybe hide the cheese, just in case.